Used to be a cop myself.
My name's Leon. I'm with the RPD.
Only for a day, though.
I won't let you down, Marvin.
Somehow I managed to get myself involved with the incident in Raccoon City. On my first day in the force.
The year is 2005. Resident Evil 4 was just released. This subsequently came with a lot of praise due to the reinvention of an already successful franchise. This stems from its changing gameplay, the new enemies, but most notably its main protagonist, because here, Leon Kennedy makes his return, but this time around would helm the charge in this new direction that the RE franchise was heading, showing to be a very capable government operative, a far cry from his one and only day as a police officer in Resident Evil 2. And on top of his newly acquired combat skills, the implementation of a sardonic type of personality was fully highlighted, with many moments shown throughout RE4 displaying this character trait.
Your right hand comes off?
But with that said, it's important for us to trace back Leon's story prior to his adventure in RE4, where we explain his initial concept design, the drastic changes made that eventually resulted into the character that we see right in front of us, and what important events that set the foundation for this religious community. So without any further ado, let's begin our video of the life and origins of Leon Kennedy before Resident Evil 4.
6 years have passed since that horrendous incident.
As stated by Leon, 6 years have passed since his nightmarish adventure during Resident Evil 2. This was a surprise to him at that time due to the lack of combat experience under his belt, but here now in Resident Evil 4, that has all been changed, showing Leon to be much more combat efficient. This is important, especially with the new types of enemies he'll be facing throughout this game, with the origins of this change in character design stems from the early developments of Resident Evil 4, which if you did not know, this game had several iterations that it went through that had to either be scrapped or changed into an entirely different game. Examples of these were the famous Hookman gameplay, with the early version of RE4 showing Leon to be haunted by the stalker Hookman enemy, which was famously shown in E3 2003, though it was mentioned that this foe wouldn't actually be part of the final product, but instead was there to showcase the implementation of the new QTE, or QuickTime Event System, with Leon. Another concept that coincided with this was a living dolls enemy, with this concept development stems from the hallucinatory factor that afflicted Leon, which he would be haunted by the supernatural-like enemies, seeing numerous dolls attacking him. And next was the fog version of RE4, with the early concept of this game had Leon part of the US government agency, the USS Stratcom, with this mission setting to be played inside Oswald E. Spencer's castle, who was one of the co-founders of the evil Umbrella Corporation. Having to raid this Umbrella headquarters led Leon to be infected by fog-like B.O.W., though gameplay footage of this early concept has seldom been revealed.
We didn't want you telling everyone any unnecessary information.
So even with these early iterations, they still stuck to the survival horror genre side of things that was still mostly prevalent at that time in the RE franchise. But one of the more famous products from the early development of Resident Evil 4 was the creation of a brand new franchise entirely, with a focus more on the action-heavy and stylish combat, but still set in a gothic castle setting, with a character who had a boisterous personality that had some semblance to the traits that we saw with Leon in the finalized version of RE4, with that game being so it's no wonder why Dante and Leon drew some comparisons around that time, and from these early roots of development of RE4 blossomed what we saw in the end version that has been touted as one of the greatest games of all time. And as this sardonic type of personality that we aforementioned took shape, showing Leon to have the confidence regardless of whatever adversaries he'd face, in some instances openly mocking the enemies and twisting their own words around in a humorous fashion, hence giving us many iconic moments that perfectly suits his character portrayal during his adventure in Resident Evil 4.
When your assimilation with Las Plagas is complete, I'll have you serve as my guard.
Thanks. That should keep me company, 'cause boredom kills me.
watching Leon stare out in the wilderness, with this moment represents the literal calm before the storm, with his task at hand was to locate and rescue the US president's missing daughter, Ashley Graham, and the intel prior to his mission could be summarized from one of the files found in the midst of his adventure in the game, stating, she was kidnapped by an unidentified group while on her way home from her university. The kidnapper's motives are still unknown, although there's reliable information that the perpetrator is an insider. The guys in intelligence say that they have reliable information that Ashley's been sighted somewhere in Europe. This information plays a crucial role for some of the villains in RE4, being that different motives push their own narrative forward, and Ashley, being the initial cog that propagates the story arc of this game, sets the foundation for Leon's mission. This is why he was brought to this remote village area somewhere in Europe, not knowing that he'd face a completely different type of enemy and organization compared to what he saw during the Raccoon City incident in Resident Evil 2, where zombies and multitudes of B.O.W.s that the Umbrella Corporation created were fought in that game. In contrast, Leon faces a much more normal type of enemy, being that of a ganado, who was located at the first house once arriving in this isolated area, and then shortly after being approached, the resident attacks Leon immediately after presenting a picture of Ashley.
¿Qué carajo estás haciendo aquí? ¡Lárgate, cabrón!
Freeze!
Though neutralized with relative ease, it was made apparent that this style change of enemies and combat perfectly complements the new direction that Leon's character portrayed.
I had no choice but to neutralize him.
Because for any long-standing series, the natural progression for its games and characters have had a tendency to one-up the predecessor, and in the Resident Evil franchise, this came in the form of more action, explosions, and straying a bit farther and farther away from the slow-paced survival horror genre. So this early encounter with the ganado and Leon's character portrayal in Resident Evil 4 perfectly embodies this new direction that the franchise was headed, and this is much needed for his mission due to the plethora of enemies that he'd encounter. But moving along, he eventually makes his way to the heart of the village, with the population seemingly going about their day-to-day task, showing no signs of hostility. Well, that is until they spot Leon. With a quick change in behavior, the locals take no time to show their aggression towards the American. This results in Leon fighting many variants of ganado, while also being introduced to some key characters. This includes Luis Serra, who was found as a captive, and shortly thereafter, we're introduced to B.O.W.s Mendez, also known as the Big Cheese, though at that time, seldom was the information presented for these characters. But in the grand scheme of the background lore in Resident Evil 4, both of these individuals played a massive part that resulted into the current state of the village and its population. And to make matters worse for Leon, who was captured alongside Luis Serra, would be injected with a gift by the new organization that propagated the events in this game, who was known as the Los Illuminados, a cult who had its roots in this remote area spanning centuries back, with their central focus was to worship what was known as a Las Plagas parasite, a mind-altering organism that had the capabilities to transform its host, while those who had a dominant form of this plaga was able to control those of lower ranking. Well, this information explains why the normal-looking ganados were so hostile to those they deemed an outsider, and the command for this hostility comes from his leader, Osmond Sadler, a former bioweapons researcher who was able to manipulate those in power within this village region, converting them to join the Los Illuminados and have them receive the Las Plagas parasite within them. So now with this chance encounter with the leader of the cult, which happens shortly after Leon finds and rescues Ashley, which all this happens inside the village church. Here Sadler introduces himself and lets Leon and Ashley know that they're carriers of this plaga parasite. So with this predicament at hand, it was their objective to somehow remove this parasite inside their body and to find a way out of this area controlled by the Los Illuminados. So with that said, this eventually brings our protagonist to the outer edges of the village, where hordes of ganados had Leon and Ashley cornered, but luckily for them, Luis Serra does offer a helping hand to get rid of their aggressors.
Leon! Small world, eh? Well, I see that the president's equipped his daughter with ballistics, too.
How rude! And I don't believe there's any relevance with my figure and my standing. Who are you?
Oh, excuse me, Your Highness. Perhaps the young lady might want to introduce herself first before asking someone his name.
Her name's Ashley Graham, the president's daughter.
Is she... well, you know.
Don't worry. She's cool.
Never mind. There's supposed to be some kind of obvious symptom before you turn into one of them anyway.
Look!
Ashley, upstairs!
Okay, it's game time.
This causes the Ganados to eventually stop their attacks, giving Leon and Ashley the chance to proceed onward away from the village and towards the castle location, though a final obstacle needs to be dealt with, which a boss battle encounter hindering their progression comes in with B.O.W.s. And as mentioned before, this giant man had an extensive history that caused the current situation of the village and its population, which sometime in the past, B.O.W.s was one of those in power who was manipulated by Sadler to join the Los Iluminados, and this was crucial because B.O.W.s was a village priest and the de facto leader of this small remote community. This allowed his influence to spread amongst the villagers and swayed them to join the Los Iluminados and receiving the Las Plagas parasite inside them, altering their bodies and mind, and being under full control of those with a dominant plaga, which Father B.O.W.s had inside of his body. And with this information, here we have a clear example of someone with a dominant plaga that Leon would have to face, showing the big cheese to elongate his body with an almost centipede-like form and with claw-like arms protruding out of his back. This transformation only occurred once B.O.W.s was dealt with a large explosion in his proximity, so now that leaves Leon in a boss battle against B.O.W.s inside this small barnyard setting, with the conclusion was the defeat of the Big Cheese. This allows a pathway to move forward for Leon and Ashley, where the two arrived at the Salazar castle that loomed over the village, which shortly after arriving within the fortress, were introduced to the main antagonist of this section of the game, who was Ramon Salazar, the 8th Castellan and the last of his family, which his ancestor was known to have sealed off the Las Plagas parasite underneath the castle and ridding the Los Iluminados centuries back, though that'd be the opposite for Ramon Salazar, and like B.O.W.s, he too was manipulated into joining the Los Iluminados by Sadler, which a note from Salazar's butler recounts on this topic, where he writes, knowing that Senor Ramon Salazar has no family, Lord Sadler must have used his strong faith in the Los Iluminados to his advantage to talk Senor Salazar into undoing the seal of the Las Plagas once done by his ancestor. Senor Salazar would never do such a thing unless he was in some way being used unknowingly. I should have sensed the Lord's dirty scheme sooner. I feel I'm partly responsible for all of this. I have no idea as to what the Lord is planning, but Senor Salazar was just being used. It is too late now, however. Senor Salazar has already taken the plaga into his body. There is no turning back once the plaga has turned into an adult in the body. The plaga parasite will not die unless the host dies. There's no cure. Perhaps Senor Salazar may have been vaguely aware of the Lord's plan all along, but it's so hard to tell. Nevertheless, there's nothing I can do about it now.
I have absolute control.
So after reading that, it's interesting to know some of the backstory for Leon's more eccentric adversary, who compared to the Big Cheese, Ramon was much more outspoken in nature, resulting in Leon to have many great banters with him, but to his unfortunate expense.
You're nothing but an extra in my script.
I don't ever remember being a part of your crappy script.
Though the quips between the two results in Leon further being tormented by Salazar, laying many traps for our protagonist, and taking Ashley from his care. So now once separated, Leon has to look for her again, but in the midst of all this, he does reunite with a familiar face from the past, with that person being Ada Wong, which later on in this video, we'll delve into their past partnership during the Raccoon City incident in Resident Evil 2, but in the immediate circumstance had her as a mercurial character who would assist Leon to a certain extent in the shadows, but all the while doing it to achieve her objectives, being a character that pops in and out at opportune times during Leon's mission. But with that said, Leon does continue on his adventure inside of the castle, where at some point he again makes contact with Lewis, revealing to Leon that he worked for Sadler and the Los Iluminados as a researcher, but turned against them sometime after. Also, he would give Leon some medication that would suppress the Las Plagas parasite's growth inside of both his and Ashley's body, but this comes at the expense of his life when Sadler catches up to him.
Now that I have the sample, you serve me no purpose.
Sadler took it. You have to get it back.
So now moving on from this sad state, Leon does again reunite with Ashley for a short while. That is until she's taken away and sent to a remote island location, prompting the next step for Leon in this case to follow Ashley's suit. But before he could follow her, he has to deal with Ramon Salazar in his mutated form. And like Torres Mendez, he too had a dominant plaga inside of him, but the manifestation of his transformation was mixed in with a queen plaga that was sprouting on the wall shown here, with the end result is this monstrosity. But after defeating Ramon Salazar, Leon's way was clear to follow Ashley to that island, and again Ada would provide some assistance to make it to that location. Here, once arriving at the island, Leon does face more of the Los Iluminados, which came in the form of the military variation, and on top of this was the added nightmarish monsters like the Regenerator and U3. But the important story factor that Leon would encounter in this last third portion of the game was the reunion with an operative that Sadler would send to deal with Leon, and this person of interest happens to be Jack Krauser, a former US government agent and once comrade of Leon, who 2 years prior did have a mission together in Operation Javier, which we'll discuss further later on the video as well. But at the current time, Jack Krauser would be one of the main antagonists of the last portion of the game, and later we find out that he was the one responsible for the kidnap of Ashley in the first place, with his reasons for this was to gain Osmond Sadler's full trust. So this intel that Leon was briefed on prior to his mission to save Ashley was correct, where it was stated that someone from the inside could have been the perpetrator, and now with this revelation that Jack Krauser was responsible for this act fulfilled that suspicion.
You're the one who kidnapped Ashley.
But like with the previous two main bosses, eventually Leon does have a final confrontation with his former comrade.
Witness the power!
Also, mind you, just keep this detail of his left arm's mutation, because some connections can be made with that fact with his mission from Operation Javier. But with that said, the two former comrades go toe-to-toe in this boss battle, with the most effective means to defeat Krauser was using a knife. Funny enough, this close quarters combat style was already highlighted earlier in RE4 when the two encountered each other for the first time in this game. And just to give more credit to Leon's overall character growth, the fact that his proficiency using a knife was definitely a key skill set that he picked up on once he became a government operative, where he was able to use this weapon to save himself and others a couple of times in RE4, and the fact that eventually this culminates as one of the most effective means to defeat Krauser only proves the importance of this particular combat skill of Leon, allowing him to proceed on to find Ashley and try to remove the Las Plagas parasite inside of their bodies, because at the current state, the Plaga was slowly maturing to the point that allows Osmond Sadler to take control of their minds. This was one of the objectives of the Los Iluminados, where he would send Ashley back to the United States after being infected with it and be one of the influencing factors that could sway the decision making of the US president in favor of the Los Iluminados' goals. So with that scenario seen as an absolute catastrophic event, it was imperative for Leon to remove the Plaga as soon as possible before any more symptoms surface, which fortunately enough, they do find a machine that's able to remove the Plagas inside of their bodies using a special type of radiation, and it was noted in Lewis's notes that this procedure was extremely painful due to the Plaga connecting itself to the host's nerves, and that death could be a possibility as well. But in this case with Leon and Ashley, they both survived the removal process and allows them to move on forward to the final act of the game, where they deal with Osmond Sadler and escape the island, with one encounter just prior to the final boss battle shows Sadler to be superhuman-like, being able to move at extreme speeds and subduing Leon with one hit, though Ada does make an appearance and saves our protagonist, with an important factor shown here was Sadler's ability to absorb so much damage from conventional weapons, where he's able to extract the bullets from his body, showing very little damage taken. So with that, this only sets the expectation for Leon's upcoming boss fight with Sadler, showing him to host the strongest dominant Plaga we've seen yet, with the final encounter starts here as Leon finds Sadler nearby captured Ada Wong, but to his dismay, finds out that Leon was successful in removing the Las Plagas parasite from his body, allowing him to be free from the mind control aspect they used against Ashley. But even with this, Sadler does mutate into this horrid spider-like monster. Eventually, Leon does win against the leader of the Los Iluminados, with the final blow to Sadler was with the use of a rocket launcher. So now, with the defeat of the final antagonist, the last thing that needs to be done is to escape the island. But before this, Ada does one thing to finish her objective, which was to retrieve a sample of the Las Plagas from Leon. Though reluctant, he does hand over the sample. So as a parting gift, Ada does reward him with a way to escape the island before its destruction, with the final escape scene was with Leon and Ashley using the jet ski that Ada left for them, which allows them to make it out alive, with Ashley being very thankful for Leon, hence ending his mission in Resident Evil 4.
Hunnigan, is that you?
Finally, the line's jack free.
Hey, Hunnigan, no glasses.
Forget the glasses. What's the status of the mission?
I've rescued the subject. We're returning home.
You did it, Leon.
Thanks. You know, you're kind of cute without those glasses. Give me your number when I get back.
May I remind you that you're still on duty?
Story of my life.
So I wanted to cover Leon's story in Resident Evil 4 as a start, which would allow us to see the end result of his combat experience from both Resident Evil 2 and from his mission in Operation Javier, because between these two games, we can see how slowly but surely Leon does gain more and more battle experience, which in the end does culminate into the character portrayal seen in RE4, and with this natural character progression that Leon goes through, it becomes more of an appreciation to see him in his younger years, where we finally go back to his origins, covering his character development and design, and explaining his one and only day as a rookie RPD officer in Resident Evil 2.
What's going on in this town? I don't think I've introduced myself yet. My name's Leon. I'm with the RPD. As an officer, it's my job to look out for you.
Same as discussed before, in terms of creating Leon's character in Resident Evil 4, his early iterations of his character design in Resident Evil 2 would also go through several changes throughout the development of this game, with the initial look he took on resembled Chris Redfield to some degree, which was noted by some of the developers, though the character basis of him being a rookie officer was still there, so a new direction was needed to stray away from the semblance of Chris, who at that time was already an established character from Resident Evil 1, who was portrayed as one of the elite operatives of the RPD Stars team. So having a rookie officer as a base foundation to Leon's character, that change was made to differ from his initial concept design, and through his progression, we see his model concept change to become closer and closer to what we saw in the final product in Resident Evil 2. And since this base concept revolved around the storyline of a rookie RPD officer, the origins of Leon's character was born. And just to keep things simple, we will be covering the general trajectory of his story that spans slightly before the events of Resident Evil 2 and his later escape from the city. This is important because the plot that surrounded Leon and the Raccoon City incident has had many retellings throughout the last couple of decades, changing some scenarios or the way he interacted with certain characters and how some events played out, though the general premise to his storyline stayed relatively intact, so we will keep that in mind, but I will note some key differences between the various iterations of RE2, but we'll stay on track overall with how his adventure during the Raccoon City incident unfolded, which we can begin with his origin story here, where Leon in his younger years was known to have been orphaned due to the death of both of his parents, and at that time, a police officer would be a source of inspiration for the young Leon, prompting him to eventually graduate from the police academy at the age of 21. Next now was to figure out his first assignment as a police officer, and that decision was made when he heard about some grisly murders that was occurring around Raccoon City, more specifically in the Arklay Mounds that surrounded the area. So with that, Leon's first job as an officer was set to be at the Raccoon City Police Department on September 28, 1998. So this should have been a quick and easy transition for Leon to make his way towards Raccoon City, but that trip was stalled when he and his girlfriend broke up. This would cause a small delay for Leon, where he would stop at a bar and become drunk, which would lead him to stay overnight in a motel, causing him to be a full day late from his scheduled arrival time at the city. But looking back in hindsight, his delay might have have just saved his life, because unbeknownst to him at that time, Raccoon City was in the midst of the T-virus outbreak, causing zombies, monsters, and other B.O.W.s that the Umbrella Corporation created to go rampant within that area. Also, on a quick side note, there was another retelling of Leon's planned arrival to the city, because he was warned not to come at all, delaying his arrival for a whole week, again avoiding the ongoing catastrophe due to the T-virus outbreak. But even with this small variation of detail, the general story arc stayed the same. So now the next step for Leon was to continue on in his journey as he hops in his Jeep, arriving at the night of September 29th.
Oh man, what happened?
On his way, or maybe once arriving at Raccoon City, Leon would have a chance meeting with Claire Redfield, sister of primary protagonist Chris Redfield from Resident Evil 1, with the two having their own reasons for heading towards the city, with Leon arriving for his first and only day as a police officer, and Claire looking for her missing brother. But it wouldn't be too long until the two would be met with hordes of zombies, and in an attempt to escape, they both find an abandoned police car, giving them some reprieve for a short while. That is until some unfortunate circumstance causes them to crash nearby the police station, and coinciding with this accident came in the tanker explosion, further separating the two, leading both to try to make their way towards the RPD station, where they could rendezvous and plan on their next step.
I'm okay. Head to the station. I'll meet you there.
Okay.
Well, in this instance for Leon, he does end up in the back area of the RPD station. This allowed him to make it inside the precinct first. There, he finds an injured Marvin Branagh, the would-be superior to Leon inside of the West Side office, or in RE2 Remake at the main hall.
Oh, you must be the new guy, Leon. Sorry, but it looks like your party has been cancelled.
Here, Marvin warns Leon about the zombies and monsters that infest the police station, telling him not to make the same mistakes he did and try to save any remaining survivors in the building, which Leon does oblige, leaving Marvin at the spot, even though noting the severities of his injuries.
Don't worry about me. Just rescue the survivors in the other rooms.
So inside the police department, as mentioned by Marvin, countless zombies and other nightmarish creatures hinders Leon's exploration inside the precinct, and on top of this, a stalker monster would come to haunt him for the rest of his stay in Raccoon City, which we'll get to that soon. But with that said, Leon and Claire eventually reunite inside the STARS member's office in the original Resident Evil 2. Here, Leon informs Claire that Chris has left the city, giving her his diary, so the only recourse now for the two was to find any remaining survivors and escape the city. Though the retelling in RE2 Remake, Leon and Claire's reunion happens outside the RPD building, with the two parting ways again due to an explosion of a crashed helicopter on the second floor. So now, as they continue on their separate adventures inside the police station, the next important destination that Leon finds himself in was at the basement or parking lot area. Here, he would be acquainted with Ada Wong, the same one who helped him on his adventure in Resident Evil 4 6 years later, though at this present time in RE2, she keeps her true motives a secret, stating to Leon that she was there looking for her missing boyfriend John. And comparing this scenario to Resident Evil 2 Remake, Ada in that version saves Leon from a Cerberus attack and identifies herself as an FBI agent. But regardless of the circumstance on how they met and her initial facade, in the end, Ada was there to find and retrieve a sample of the G-virus, a variant of the T-virus created by one of the Umbrella Corporation's top virologists, William Birkin. But with that said, the two continued their exploration in the lower parts of the RPD station, where they eventually meet Ben Bartolucci, who was found behind bars, with the reasons for this was because he was investigating into the corrupt police chief Brian Irons and his shady dealings with the Umbrella Corporation, while Ada in the original Resident Evil 2 took this opportunity to ask Ben for any information about her boyfriend. Though unsuccessful, he does give info on how to escape the RPD station using the passageway through the sewers. Unfortunately for Ben though, he would be infected by a now mutated William Birkin, which would lead to his eventual death.
My chest! It's burning! What's wrong?
where in comparison here in RE2 Remake, Ben Bartolucci would be killed off quickly by one of the tyrants that the Umbrella Corporation sent, with that one being Mr. X. And the sole purpose of this tyrant was to retrieve a sample of the G-Virus, but also deal with anyone that acts as an obstacle to his mission. This does come to pass when Leon again was saved by Ada when caught by this monster, subduing it for the time being, which allows the two to continue on towards the sewer.
Let's get out of here.
With the slight difference here was that Leon and Ada in RE2 Remake made a small pit stop at the Kendo gun shop. Here they're found by the owner, Robert Kendo, where in a brief cutscene we get a great character development for Leon, showing him to be steadfast in his conviction of helping those in need, though at that time still was easily manipulated by Ada, showing that he's still green in terms of the real-world motives of those around him.
My mission is to take down Umbrella's entire operation. We may not make it out.
Whatever it takes to save this city. Count me in.
But moving past this moment, they continue on through the night. Leon and Ada do have some close encounters, with one resulting in Leon being injured when Annette Birkin, the wife of the monster William Birkin, was trying to shoot Ada.
Leon. This bullet wound isn't making things any easier.
Quiet, Leon. I'll patch you up.
Well, Ada at that point did help Leon recover somewhat from his injuries, as the two continue on further in the sewers, eventually finding the route that leads to the final setting of this game, which was the Umbrella Corporation's secret lab, also known as Nest. Along the way, Leon is still stalked by Mr. X and William Birkin, but would be able to survive those chance encounters from both of those monsters. Ada on one hand did sustain some injuries of her own from William, with Leon telling her to rest for the time being. Ada does object to this, telling Leon that she'll just slow him down and that he just needs to save himself. Leon does not agree to this and reassures her that they'll both escape, though we can compare this to RE2 remakes. Here, Leon and Ada share a moment while on their way to the Nest facility. So now with that, in both versions of Resident Evil 2, Leon does obtain a sample of the G-Virus while inside the Nest facility, all the while was informed by Annette Birkin that Ada was not who she says she was, revealing to him that she was actually there to retrieve the sample of the G-Virus. Leon dismisses this information, but to his disappointment, Ada does reveal this fact to be true in their next meeting, as the two would have a small confrontation about the matter. And in the midst of all this, Ada does find herself reluctant to harm Leon in the process of taking the G-Virus from him, though soon after, Annette Birkin does make an appearance, shooting a non-fatal shot at Ada. This would cause her to stumble and almost fall to the edge of the bridge, with Leon and Ada having one last moment together, which in the end had her falling to her supposed death. And in the process of all this turmoil, Leon does decide to throw away the G-Virus. So now when making the comparison between the two versions of Resident Evil 2, the general premise stayed intact and just had some minor differences with the way things played out at this moment, which in the end arrived at the same conclusion: Ada separated from Leon and the G-Virus sample gone from his possession. So now with that, the only thing left to do now was to escape the laboratory. Here, Leon does reconnect with Claire, with both heading towards the lower level train area. While on his way, Leon does encounter Mr. X for the final time, who at that point transformed into a super tyrant form. Well, interestingly enough, in the latter portion of this boss battle against Mr. X, Ada does help Leon from the shadows, giving him the means to destroy this tyrant.
We'll call it even.
So with this last moment appearance, it only confirms that Ada did survive her fall, explaining how she makes a reappearance 6 years later in Resident Evil 4. So now with the defeat of Mr. X, Leon and Claire make their escape on the train with a young Sherry Birkin, with the final hurdle happens when a grotesquely mutated William Birkin was found on board the train as well, and the last ditch effort was trying to stop our protagonist from escaping, which in the end, this results in giving us one of the best cutscenes in the Resident Evil franchise.
Warning, warning, the self-destruct system has been activated. Each train compartment will detonate sequentially. Repeat, each train compartment will detonate sequentially.
Leon, stop the train!
I can't. The door to the control room is locked.
What is it?
Sherry, get back!
Claire! Where are you?
Sherry! What are you doing?
We have to stop the train, right? I can do it!
Sherry! Persistent, aren't you? Well, come and get it!
Which one's the right switch? Maybe this one? Sherry! Claire! Ah!
Can't hold on much longer.
Push the switch over there! Got it!
Finally.
Are you okay, Sherry?
I'm okay.
Where's Leon? Leon? Leon!
Right here.
Leon!
You're both safe. Just die. We've got to get out of here. Move it! Go!
So, it's finally over. Sherry, you look terrible.
No worse than you, Claire.
Come on, time to leave.
Now? What's wrong? Is something following us?
We have to go. We don't have any time to waste.
Go? Where?
Hey, it's up to us to take out Umbrella.
So now with Leon, Claire, and Sherry escaping Raccoon City on the morning of September 30th, 1998, the three march on towards the outskirts of the city, and from the final scenes in both versions of Resident Evil 2, one would have thought that Leon and company would have stuck around together for the foreseeable future. Leon's own words state this fact.
As long as we stick together, we'll be fine.
But even with that said, it just wasn't meant to be. Leave us alone. Claire Redfield couldn't believe Leon's words. Leon continued, "You're looking for your brother, right? Just go." Claire knew that Leon and Sherry needed immediate medical attention, but she could not waste any more time. I'll be back. I promise," she said as she disappeared into the wilderness alone. The sudden separation between Claire and Leon after escaping Raccoon City comes as a bit of a surprise, because we can understand that Claire still wanted to look for her missing brother Chris, while in doing so leaving Sherry in Leon's care. Though soon after, the two were eventually found by the United States military. Here, Leon was apprehended, while Sherry was placed in protective custody. With the text here reveals some information on that specific event. Leon Scott Kennedy is confronted with a man who claims to be a US government agent. Leon says, "Leave Sherry alone, she is innocent." "She knows too much," the man replies. He looks at Leon and says, "But you have value. This is a good deal. Make your choice." Without regret or hesitation, Leon closes his eyes and then sharply responds,
"I don't believe this."
Here, Leon was left with no choice but to consider the offer that was given to him. Also revealed later that the person who recruited Leon to become a government agent was Adam Benford, who at that time was a government agent himself, but later in Resident Evil 6 was a sitting United States president.
Bioorganic weapons are a global threat.
So with that, Adam did see the potential in Leon, even though he was only a rookie officer for the RPD, because his one and only night in Raccoon City provided Leon the battle experience against many bioorganic weapons. So with that as a core foundation moving forward, he'd be trained from that standpoint to counteract against any further use of B.O.W.s, improving his overall skill set, especially his close quarters combat. Well, this would serve him perfectly 4 years later when he was sent in a location in South America, initiating his mission of Operation Javier. The year is 2002. 4 years have passed since the Raccoon City incident. Leon during this time was trained to become a highly proficient US government agent with his background of fighting against bioorganic weapons and the connections that the Umbrella Corporation had with those monsters. So the next mission that Leon takes on perfectly suits his skill set, because intel gathered by the US government found a man by the name of Javier Hidalgo was in contact with a former Umbrella Corporation researcher, and that he was a known drug lord of a specified region in South America and was using both the T-virus and T-Veronica virus, which he would experiment on the local population, causing an outbreak similar to the Raccoon City incident, with zombies running rampant in the community. But the reasons for his sudden use of these viral strains has yet to be clarified. Well, now here comes Leon trying to investigate into the matter. Also alongside him on his mission, another operative by the name of Jack Krauser, the same man that Leon would eventually fight in Resident Evil 4 2 years later, but here would serve to assist him on his mission of Operation Javier. So now with the two located in the middle of the jungle in South America, they proceed on to the nearest village. Here they fight zombies and monsters alike. At the end of their search into the village, they meet a young girl by the name of Manuela, where she was found singing inside of a church, while a monster was calmly by her side. Well, sometime later, Leon and Krauser would find Javier, and it was revealed that Manuela was actually his daughter, and that the reason he was in contact with a former Umbrella researcher was so that he could use a viral strain, more specifically the T-Veronica virus, on Manuela, because who, like her mother before her, had an incurable disease. So sometime in the past, Javier initially used the T-virus on the mother, curing her from her ailments, but caused her to mutate into the monster that we saw with Manuela while she was singing inside of that church. So learning from this, Javier sought to use the T-Veronica virus instead to keep her alive from her illness. Once figuring this out, Leon questioned how Manuela was still able to hold off mutating due to the virus inside of her body and not turn into a monster like so many others that were inoculated with the viral strain. Well, it's revealed later to Leon by Javier that Manuela needed to have her organs constantly transplanted to prevent any further mutations. After finding this out, Krauser had some inner monologues about Manuela's viral infection and later on the power she reveals, as he believes the beneficial application to the virus if used in a proper way. Though keeping this information to himself, this thought process continues to become a driving force for his later beliefs, but we'll get to that soon.
Well, I don't know about Leon, but my loyalties lie not with any one given organization. At the end of the day, all they want is results, and that's what I provide, for the right price. Look, I don't care what people think of me. I get the job done, and then I'm gone.
Because as they proceed on in Operation Javier, Krauser ends up having his left arm injured by Manuela's mutated mother, and funny enough, looking back in hindsight, is the same arm that mutated when he fought Leon in Resident Evil 4, only foreshadowing his later use of that arm as his sword and shield. Though at the present moment, Krauser found himself weakened from this incident, this will be one of the important catalysts that later solidifies his beliefs of using a virus to make him stronger again after his injuries. But before that would happen, Leon, Krauser, and Manuela would have a final confrontation with Javier, who at that point was losing his sanity, allowing himself to be absorbed by a plant infected by the T-Veronica virus, transforming him into a gigantic monster who wanted to absorb Manuela to gain the power she's benefited from the virus inside of her body. So with the behemoth in sight, Krauser's inner monologue continues on, seeing the potential and powers that the virus can imbue for those infected by it, as he plans to harness the virus's powers, stating that would be the start of his rebirth. So all the while this was going on in Krauser's head, in the midst of this battle, Leon does save Manuela from an attack, but a subsequent strike would be stopped by her, displaying a similar skill set that was seen with Alexia Ashford, the main antagonist of Resident Evil Code Veronica, where in that game, she too used the powers from the T-Veronica virus, with her blood combusting into flames that was used to attack her enemies. Leon, seeing this firsthand, is amazed by this feat, again questioning how Manuela was still fully conscious without any drawbacks from the virus. Krauser also astonished by the sight, which only cements his already twisted views of the virus's potential, as he knows that those who can wield the viral strain without repercussion would benefit from his powers. But by the end, Javier is defeated, with all three making it out alive, and with two different endings in Operation Javier. This will take into account what Manuela's outcome would be. She would either come to accept her situation and be at peace, vanishing into a burst of light, leaving both Leon and Krauser to head back to the United States, with the other ending being that Leon convinces Manuela to live on, eventually having her in the custody of the US government, which Leon does keep tabs on her after arriving back home, narrating that no further mutations have occurred at that point. All the while, Jack Krauser observes the two and sees Leon in a negative light as he laments on the injury to his left arm, and it was noted by Leon that he didn't fully recover from this and would later be decommissioned. This would prompt Krauser to somehow contact Albert Wesker to help him mend his injuries, which only further propagates his later role as a villain, with the final news that Leon hears from his comrade was that he died in a helicopter crash sometime later on. But in the end, this mission that Leon undertakes only furthers his combat experience, which is a great bridge between his character portrayal seen in Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 4, which of course only prepares him for his eventual mission for the latter. Also, this Operation Javier is a great setup to his acquaintance with Jack Krauser, giving a bit more context about their background and how well they used to work together. But during the course of the mission, Krauser's inner monologues only proves his later stray towards being a future antagonist of the series, where it connects his eventual collaboration with Albert Wesker and seeing him as the inevitable antagonist we battle in Resident Evil 4. Seeing the transformation that Leon undergoes from being a rookie officer in Resident Evil 2 to his more combat-ready portrayal in Resident Evil 4 was great to see, and in a way was a great representation in how the series was trending during their respective releases, with Resident Evil 2 giving us a fresh take on a sequel, but still exploring the after effects that occurred in Resident Evil 1, because here is where Leon comes into play, because instead of using an already established character like Chris Redfield, it was decided to give us a new character, a rookie officer, a starring role, which was perfect for newcomers to the Resident Evil series, which is a great way for new players to connect with Leon's experience facing many monsters created by the Umbrella Corporation, and the fact that his portrayal in Resident Evil 4 almost coincides with the way the player base for this franchise grew as well. But with that said, the newest iteration for Leon will come with Resident Evil 4 Remake's release, with a short RE4 trailer portrays him in a depressive state, who is traumatized by his experience during Resident Evil 2, which this is a great character portrayal that needs to be explored, where Leon needs to overcome his inner demons while on his mission to save the president's missing daughter, which this is a perfect foundation for any character development in that game. Be that as it may, we can only speculate on how all this will play out in that, as they call it, reimagining of Resident Evil 4. So with that said, what are your thoughts about Leon as a character? Did you guys like his transformation from a rookie officer to a well-honed government agent? And are you guys excited for this newest iteration of Resident Evil 4? Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, you guys have a great rest of your day, and this is DeVuH, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
It's good to see you're still among the living.